So before our speaker comes on, I just want to welcome everybody to another talk in our series, Conversations with the Past. This week, we're excited to host Amy Godine. Longtime Adirondack Life contributor, Amy has been writing about the Adirondack social history since 1989, with an emphasis on Black and ethnic history, migratory Adirondackers, and the stories of other non-elites. Exhibitions she has written or curated on ethnic history have appeared in the Chapman Museum, the Saratoga History Museum, and the Adirondack Museum. Her exhibition, Dreaming of Timbuktu, the story of an abolitionist founded Black farm settlement in North Elba before the Civil War, is on permanent display at the John Brown Farm Historic Site in Lake Placid. So please join me in welcoming Amy for her talk, Slavery's Stubborn Imprint, Legacies of White Supremacism in Warren County.
Thanks to all of you for coming. I have such warm memories of this place because a million years ago, I curated an exhibit here, and it was just great fun to work with the staff and find this stuff. It was about 5 ethnic communities, as I recall, in the southeastern Adirondacks. About 3 or 4 of them were in Glens Falls, and it was a blast. It was just such a great collection, and the staff couldn't have been sweeter, and we had a good opening night too, so that was fun. Did anyone here go to that? Even my husband can't remember it, which is really embarrassing. Yeah. Of course, he says, I think I remember, which means he's not remembering it. Yeah. All right, I'm going to do something that's really irritating, but I'm going to try and keep eye contact throughout. I'm going to read from a prepared script, because if I don't, I'm going to lose my way. So it's for your good and mine. And I'll start off. I can't think of a better way to introduce this talk. In fact, with the subject I think this audience probably knows well, Solomon Northup. But I don't want to talk about his 12 years of enslavement. We've all read, or should, his terrific autobiography and seen the movie. What interests me are the brackets of his catastrophe. Northup was a Warren County native, born in Minerva to a free Black farmer and a registered voter. A working man and literate, Solomon found jobs as a farmhand, a canal repairman at Towman with employees, a sawyer, and a fiddler of sufficient talent to hire out to several Saratoga Springs hotels. Ann Hampton, and Cliff, you'll correct me on this at the end if I'm getting any of his bio wrong, because you know better than anyone here. Ann Hampton, his wife and the mother of their 3 children, matched his work ethic job for job, cooking at local taverns, at the esteemed United States Hotel in Saratoga and at the Carpenter's Hotel in Glens Falls, and also, I guess, in Bolton Landing. Accounts of Northup's story, from the one he co-wrote with the white journalist from Whitehall to the Oscar-winning movie, conclude his drama with his liberation and reunion with his family in Saratoga Springs. But the restoration of Northup's legal freedom did not mark the end of white supremacism's impact on his life. The man who sold him into slavery was caught and tried in Washington, D.C., but since Black men in the Capitol couldn't testify against white people, the enslaver was acquitted. Northup's northern kidnappers were located and charged in New York, but at the end of the day, the jurisdiction of the case was in Washington, where the D.C. government let it drop. Northup himself would never regain his footing after 12 traumatizing years in Mr. Epps' forced labor camp in Louisiana. He worked the anti-slavery lecture circuit with some very famous names, including Reverend Henry Highland Garnett of Troy, but he drank a lot. He left his wife. He eventually disappeared without a trace, impressing the writer of Ann Hampton's obituary as, quote, a worthless vagabond. Worthless, I don't know about, but it's clear enough the unrelenting, vicious impact of his 12 years of enslavement would continue to shape and misshape this once resilient, versatile working man's post-bondage prospects for years after his return. The story of slavery's claim on his body and being didn't start with his kidnapping, and it didn't end with his release. Just so our understanding of slavery in Warren County, we can say Legal slavery ended in New York in 1827, and recall with pride the very short list of Warren County people who we knew were enslaved. I mean, pride because the list was not short, was so short, not because enslaved people were here. John Glenn, the man who gave this town his name, owned slaves, so did John Thurman. And no surprise given this family's deep roots in Dutch New York. But these men were exceptions. Go east to Washington County, and especially Easton or Salem, or south to Rensselaer County, named for the slave-owning patroon, and the social landscape changes, reflecting the influence of the exuberantly pro-slavery Dutch farmers who pressed north from the Hudson River Valley, and Huguenots who followed their example. Go north to Clinton County, you'll find many instances of not plantation style slavery, but more intimate, small scale, small farm enslavement, which may sound cozier and more tolerable, but was every bit as brutal as anything down south. But Warren County's non-Indigenous backstory was Anglo-American and largely New England descended Yankee or Quaker or Scotch. And by the time these pioneers claimed this region, anti-slavery feeling predominates. I don't think it dominates, but it's pervasive. So why am I talking about the legacies of slavery where it almost never happened? Maybe this suggests a clue. When Hitler came to power, Germany's Jewish population was less than 1%. Yet anti-Semitism, as we know, was a driving theme in Nazi ideology. The reach of a prejudicial bias has no need of personal exposure or experience. And in this country, in the rural North, from the first days of European settlement, a derogatory idea of Blackness claimed a territory much wider than where Black people lived. The reach of slavery, its unflagging interest in keeping a toxic idea of a lesser race alive and unassailable among white Americans, found the Adirondacks and all the free rural North every day. It made its point in taverns, school books, news sheets, and opera houses. It underscored it on election day when Black people couldn't vote unless they had $250 worth of real estate until 1870. It revealed itself in what Adirondack children would name their pets, hundreds of them, dogs and kittens called by a racist name we don't speak aloud today, which I know because of lost and found columns in 19th century newspapers that listed these. I couldn't believe how many I once counted. Incredible. And it didn't just vanish when slavery was abolished. The legacies of slavery pressed their claims for generations. How Blackness would be understood would be defined by American slavery long after slavery itself was outlawed, and how slavery was rationalized would look to white ideas about Blackness for its defense. In 1831, the Warren County Messenger ran a syndicated short story from a popular children's magazine, The Juvenile Forget-Me-Not. While the genteel Forget-Me-Not was English, it had a Philadelphia office too, whose writers, I am guessing, were responsible for the Traveling Tin Man, an American story founded on fact. Our protagonists, a tight-knit, modestly prosperous Quaker farm family in rural Pennsylvania, with aging upright parents, a strapping and devoted son, young bright daughters, and a servant, Chloe, who is Black and free, invite a visiting peddler into their home to join them for dinner after they've shopped a little at his cart. His appetite impresses everyone, but more noticeable still is all the bread and cheese he stuffs into his pockets when he thinks no one can see. How horrible, the girls declare after dinner, that anybody could be so hungry. So while he's repairing broken tinware for their parents, they sneak out to take more food to his wagon so he can eat on the road when he returns to his route. That's when they discover his secret passenger, a Black girl hidden among all the pots. Dinah, 7 and free, is, they learn, the peddler's captive. He enticed her for a wagon ride when she was out picking huckleberries, and then he sped away with her in tow, lashed her to his wagon, and shared his plan to spirit her to Maryland, where he planned to sell her fast. She was frightened and very concerned about her parents, who she knew would be worried sick. All ends well, of course. This is a family newspaper. The daughters got word back to their family. The men surge to the kidnapped girl's defense. The peddler lifts his whip. The farm boy knocks him down. The Warners tie up the kidnapper and get word to the constable, who comes with a warrant and half the village to walk him back to court. A trial, fine, and jail time await. Dinah's mom and dad are reunited with their girl, jubilation all around. And when the Quaker family offers to indenture Dinah as their servant, because Chloe, remember Chloe, is not up to the job. She started strong, but she's been slacking. Dinah's grateful parents say, "You bet, take her. What an opportunity." And Dinah, 7, whose apprenticeship will end when she's 18, is delirious. Last words of this tale, Dinah turned out extremely well. And why, you wonder, would a Pennsylvania story find a home on the front page of the Warren County Messenger in 1831? For one thing, it's good filler. And the Yankee peddler was a favorite object of suspicion and disdain in Jacksonian America, the butt of comic routines all over the northeastern frontier. Quakers had a seat of honor in Warren County history too, and slavery and slave catchers in this part of New York were nobody's friend. So any one of these storylines would compel a Warren County reader, but there was another draw. Thus a subject and a theme that would have resonated too, and that is caste. As clearly sympathetic to the anti-slavery cause as this story was, it was no enemy of white supremacism. Dinah won't be enslaved, but she will know and embrace her place. Her job is to serve white people. Her free parents' job is to do the same. Servility is their rightful destiny. As sternly as this story assails slavery, it also reinforces the racialized assumptions of Black incapacity that rationalized American slavery for 3 centuries or more. How was this idea expressed in Warren County everyday life? For the better part of the 19th century and well into the 20th, before and after the era of emancipation, Adirondack newspapers ran stories like these, as well as humor, racialized humor and dialect columns, race jokes and routines that reinforced a popular idea of Black servility, immaturity, and unfitness for civic life. Blackface minstrelsy came to the Adirondack region from the streets and music halls of New York City in the mid-19th century. And in Glens Falls especially, it found a very eager audience and no lack of bookings. By the 1880s, advance notice in city newspapers was lavish of shows coming, minstrel shows coming. Editors reviewed blackface acts with care, and the names of city and county notables in attendance at these performances were proudly noted too. Professional blackface entertainments at the Opera Hall, no less than lectures at the Lyceum, marked Glens Falls' cultural arrival. Notes and ads in the Post-Star revealed 12 blackface companies that performed in Glens Falls in the 1880s alone. That's a lot. Several of them broadcasting their offerings with pre-show parades of corked up performers cakewalking down Main. And I want to make clear, these were white performers in blackface. There were blackface performers too, who had a bigger audience in the Adirondacks, I think, and they were hosted by cultural groups, churches, and they often were a little more progressive in their inventory. They didn't do the slapstick so much as plantation songs and hymns and that kind of thing. So it's a slightly different culture, drawing the blackface performers, the Black minstrels, and the white corked up, blacked up minstrels whose work was overtly, jubilantly racist. And what was blackface's tacit message? The charm of the blacked up characters, Bones and Rastus and Jemima, was a guileless, cheerful ineptitude, tolerated always by the onstage in loco parentis, the white interlocutor, who suffered their tomfoolery with a calm paternal patience. But that's just tongue-in-cheek stuff. You might be thinking, no harm meant. Maybe not, but harm was done. Let's take it from the vantage of a white schoolboy in Glens Falls after the Civil War, my imagined schoolboy that I think of experiencing this. The Union had won, the North is booming, the slaves are free. At least that's what they say. He doesn't know any ex-slaves. He doesn't know any Black people except A few dark faces he sees down by the canal who are laborers there, but he knows what they're like. He's seen the minstrel shows. He knows the songs. Blackness equals clownishness, dependency, immaturity. Blackness is a kind of joke. He also knows a darker side of blackness from his lessons. The Africa he studies in his geography book, and these are, I'm citing books now that are in the library archives in the Folklife Center that were used in Glens Falls schools. It's a savage place beset with monsters, barbarism, and horror. On this continent in Africa, serpents grow to often 80 feet in length, and a high wind called the simoon, or poisonous blast from the desert, if received into the lungs, caused instant death. There is no religion, no keeping of the golden rule, no Sunday school, just a lot of squabbling tribes, but not like our schoolboys' tribes, not like the noble red men. The poetry and essays in his grammar school review romanticize Indian eloquence among the best specimen of man in his native simplicity, even if it derided, albeit sympathetically, even as it derided sympathetically, Black men as needy, passive, and pathetically helpless. In 1859, a young scholar in Glens Falls might recite to his homeroom a long piece on the removal of the tragic removal of the Cherokees to the west, but about the forced migration of 12 million Africans to North and South America for 3 centuries, nothing would be learned or offered. Nothing would be acknowledged, not for another 100 years or more. And school is not the only source of his ideas about Black servility. The bodies harvesting his father's tobacco. I don't mean that his father has tobacco fields, that's a little clear. I mean the tobacco his father buys in his local shop. His grandmother's snuff are Black. The family's cultivating the sugar that sweetens his mother's pies, Black too. It started with an old geometry, New England traders exchanging rum for enslaved people in Africa, then trading human chattel for sugarcane and molasses in the West Indies, then sailing back to New England where molasses was distilled into rum. This was the ingenious triangle that brought this long-loved libation not just to Glens Falls taverns, but to Adirondack home kitchens, logging camps, tanneries, roadside inns, and work sites, however crude, where beans, brown sugar, and ginger cookies, ginger another slave harvested product, were baked and sweetened with molasses. And after the abolition of the slave trade, and even after emancipation, the exploitation of Black labor in the cane fields continued. Black peonage, as one scholar has famously written, was just slavery by another name. So many centuries of only knowing Black Americans in these menial capacities would make it pretty hard for our Glens Falls schoolboy, his parents, and his world to know or trust Black people any other way. A suspicion would present as gospel that this indeed was all Black bodies were really good for, that this was destiny, the fate of Ham, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. Glens Falls school children poring over their lessons on geography for little learners would encounter pictures of not Black shoemakers or barbers or storekeepers or independent farmers, but ill-clad, shoeless field workers, often children shopping cotton or getting it to market. And with the emergence of eugenics after the Civil War, this racialized view of Blackness would gain a pseudo-scientific legitimacy. Eugenics refreshed and rationalized racism in the name of genetic determinism. Among its fans, as some of you know, were prominent and influential advocates of Adirondack conservation, whose passionate defense of water, air, and forest purity all too easily extended to a concern with racial purity and the integrity of Anglo-Saxon rootstock, as it was called, or germplasm, another word for the source, the core of Anglo-Saxon purity. My point is obvious, I know, but I wonder if its very obviousness didn't also make it so familiar. It became, as familiar things can do, hidden in plain sight. Even in the mildly anti-slavery milieu of Glens Falls and the communities around it, a familiarity and dependency on slave-made products made the chance of escaping the virus we call racism, or what Earlier generations called Negrophobia, virtually nil. You might stand, that is, for abolition in your church and at the voting booth, and count it a great blessing you didn't live in the slavery accursed South. Note with pride that your county was virtually slave-free, that the general who organized the great Adirondack Regiment in the Civil War was anti-slavery from Warrensburg. I think he might have been an abolitionist, I can't remember. But if you lived in the racialized North, where so much of your life was shaped by the economy and imagery of slavery, you could not escape its messaging. Because it wasn't just rum and sugar and molasses. Every time you went to your general store to refresh your family's flannel shirts and handkerchiefs, your children's smocks, your tablecloth, your curtains, diapers, batten for your quilts, you supported the forced labor of Black slaves. Indirectly, you put up with it. Indeed, you were indebted to it, and not just to the machinery of King Cotton. You owed a debt to cane cutters and tobacco workers, to the harvesters of turpentine in the pine forests, to the enslaved mahogany cutters of Brazil who felled the massive trees for the fine furniture and veneer that made your lawyer's office so gleamingly respectable. If you played billiards or combed your hair with fine-tooth combs, or had a piano in your parlor, fresh from a factory on the Mohawk River, you owed a debt, again, to the enslaved Africans who bore the ivory tusks to market and died for it by the thousands for every 100-pound tusk of ivory, good for 45 keyboards. For every one of that group, 5 enslaved humans perished. You owed a debt, and so did every church, garage, and opera hall with the piano by the stage. Indigo, another one, the plant that gave blue jeans their rich blue hue, was tended and harvested by slaves. It was cultivated in the coastal highlands of South Carolina on soil that didn't work for rice. And when those fields gave out, indigo planters pushed west into the homelands of indigenous peoples. So indigo plantations, whose reliance on enslaved labor would argue and rationalize the seizure and enslavement of more Africans, so insisted the South Carolina planters, it colonized to the east and west alike, a double whammy here. I have still to mention the many products carried by Warren County merchants that were cultivated, harvested, packaged, and dispatched by people in bondage in the American South, Brazil, and the Caribbean. I've just mentioned raw materials so far, but on the shelves of Glens Falls Better Groceries were neatly organized sacks and packets of cocoa, coffee, sarsaparilla, mace, cloves, nutmeg, pepper sauce, and of course, most famously, rice, brought to this continent by slaves. Some historians now tell us enslaved women smuggled grains of it in their hair. That's how it got here. That Mr. Vedden's grocery store sold rice, snuff, tobacco, and every imaginable cane-based product was well advertised in the County Messenger in 1830. Not observed, Vedden surely didn't know himself, was the fact that every year, a third of the workforce that harvested and loaded rice from the malarial, snake-infested paddies of the Carolina Low Country died. Not observed, something more than sun, seed, soil, and water made this rice grow. Men, women, and children worked for it, and 10 child workers and 100 died for Carolina rice before their 16th year. No product or consumer was free of complicity. Even the abolitionist minister who ordered the latest anti-slavery hymnal from the bookstore couldn't say for sure his purchase owed nothing to the slave. Book paper and stationery, before wood was pulped and made into paper, was manufactured in the North, but slaves raised the cotton that became the rags book paper was made of. Warren County, unlike the great mining counties to the north, could not be charged with furnishing the pro-slavery Confederacy with the iron products that brought its tracks and army up to speed. But Adirondack factories did make the fine leather gloves that were advertised in Vicksburg, Charleston, Greensboro, and Mobile. For a stretch, the hemlock-rich Adirondacks was the leading leather-producing and glove-making district in the country. Gloves guard darker hands as well. house servants who drew wide the French doors and louvered windows in the plantation homes of their enslavers, poured their coffee and took their coats, wore gloves, a symbol of the servility understood to be their destiny and due. I don't see any evidence that Adirondack lumber magnates were shipping wood products to the South, which had plenty of its own. What the South really wanted were made goods, and Warren County, leather aside, was no mighty hub of industry and manufacturing for a very long time. So Adirondack capitalists, unlike the iron magnates of Troy or the shipping wizards of Connecticut, did not bank on Southern trade. But when the Civil War was over, and Northern textile magnates from Troy and Albany and elsewhere discovered Adirondack water power, the cotton-dependent shirt, pants, and collar factories of Corinth, Thurman, Warrensburg, and Ticonderoga looked south to an economy driven by debt, peonage, convict leasing, and the exploitation of freed people for its product. These are the legacies of slavery. Stitch them all together, they make a pretty gloomy web. But I don't want to leave you thinking Warren County's relationship to slavery, the contradictions people here accommodated or indulged, were any different from what was going on in Vermont or Maine or rural Pennsylvania or Oregon. I could give this lecture anywhere in the free North. I could just change the names of the stores and companies and books, and I'd have the same talk. All the free states overlooked or accommodated these awkward paradoxes, and I guess this is my point. If this county bears the name of an enslaver, who does, so do Franklin, Washington, Jefferson, Clinton, Hamilton, and Madison, to name a few. So does the Hudson River. New York was named for an enslaver. So what's the answer? Swap them out? Wipe the slate clean? I don't think so. But to consider, without flinching or rationalizing or excusing it away, just how deeply the acceptance of our slave system, our caste system, was entrenched in our economy and culture, and how easily we let ourselves take it for granted, how lastingly we took it for granted, and for how long we might, if we can do that, just start thinking about it. Just start thinking about it. We might register the beginning of a belated outrage. Nothing in the past is changeable. We don't have to shrug it off with a complacent, well, that's how it was. That's how it mostly was. But from the beginning, there were people who did fight back, who resisted the cult of white supremacism, who fought for abolition and social justice, who wore flax, God help them, instead of cotton, or dosed their biscuits with maple syrup, not molasses, who made informed choices when they could and opened their homes to fugitives and lobbied hard for equal voting rights and more. As long as there was defiance and resistance, enslaved people risking everything for freedom too, and free people helping them and risking all themselves, there were other choices that could have been made, other options besides just going along, and other choices in our time too. What happened in the days of slavery and the generations after holds up a reproachful mirror. I look at the choices people made, the sort of willful myopia they indulged, and I think uneasily, would I have chosen different? Years ago, I went to a convention for Adirondack teachers in Lake Placid on how to introduce children to what happened in slavery days, abolitionism, and racial justice. And after many stirring presentations, a professor asked the crowd, how many of you would help a fugitive slave? And everybody raised their hands. I didn't. I was astonished. How did they know? I want to think I'd make the right choice, but I wasn't so sure. The only measure that could suggest what I might have done back then is my response to crises of my own time now. Am I stepping up, taking the same kinds of risks, making choices that are difficult and awkward, choices that could isolate me, cost me, and profoundly inconvenience me? Where would I land? Where would you? Maybe this talk can provoke us all to think about our own private answers to that question. It's a tough one. I wish us honesty and courage and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very short. It seemed like it raced by. How are we
It did
doing?
race, but
I raced it
yeah,
a little bit. I'm sorry.
that's all right. Embellish. Go.
Well, some questions? Yeah,
Absolutely.
please. Who has some? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question I've wondered about a long time, and I've run into potentially different answers, so I'm going to take yours as the definitive.
Don't.
Well, I paid my bucks, I want the answer. I've been curious about, in our dollars, what sort of prices slaves were being sold at, and I've read things about $200, but of course, what does that mean 170 years ago? So do you have any understanding?
I think it would depend entirely on the slave, that person's expertise, their training, their skill.
For sure,
It
but
could be in the thousands if somebody was really a high-performing slave who was a house slave and could work with guests in the home, or was
Skilled labor.
less skilled
but in
carpenter.
that dollar or in today's dollars? Those dollars.
Well, I've seen slave notices that offer hundreds and hundreds, like 500 at least. Yeah,
There was a saying, a slave could cost more than a cow, but less than a horse.
that's interesting.
So if you're,
Okay.
if you're in any pharmacy, they'll give you a rough idea.
Yeah.
as to what you
In
can
other words,
pay.
I don't know the answer, the definitive answer to your question.
But that's
Yeah.
parameters that are,
I mean, a horse was
Interesting.
expensive, a cow was something. And women obviously were less, children much, much less. But if a woman was of childbearing age and a slave plantation was kind of a breeding plantation for enslaved babies, that woman had value too, high value. I'm not talking about attractability, I'm talking about breeding capacity. Literally, these were manufacturing sites, some of these plantations. Some more questions. Yeah,
I wonder what happened to Chloe.
I do too. There's not a word. Here's my guess about what happens to her. She's indentured to this family. She's getting lazy. They're upset about it. I think they probably lease her out through their indenture arrangement to another family that will take her in because they've got someone new to train and bring her up. But that they wouldn't have just let her go. So they've got a deal and she's got to perform, but they don't want her in the house anymore because she's just getting in the way. Yeah, one wonders about Chloe's side of this story, right? Yeah, that was such a mind-blowing thing. I found that story doing, I was down my favorite like late night, early morning wormhole, which is Northern New York Historic Newspapers website. Just hitting the names of products and seeing what popped up. And I was looking for rice. Somewhere in that story, rice is, but I couldn't find it. But that's why I read that story. That's the only thing that got me to it.
Florence, South Carolina has an amazing museum. It's half of it's art and half of it's history.
Yeah.
And they do a whole thing on the indigo plantation.
Oh, interesting.
And
Yeah.
they talk about in Florence, South Carolina.
Yeah.
It's an interesting city to visit. It really is.
Oh, yeah.
It's just a little stop. If you do the Florida, New York thing, we can make that a stop. But they did a really good job and they talked about how hard it was.
Yeah. Miserable work.
Yeah.
Like lethal.
where
And
does
they-
indigo come from?
It's a plant that has a flower or a stem or something that can be processed into dye.
They use caustic things to
Mhm.
create this dark blue inky
It's
substance.
super fashionable and of course dyed all of the blue jeans. Well, when Strauss was just starting, Levi Strauss, and working on his great blue jean empire, he was using indigo to preserve the cloth and make it bright and lasting. Someone had a question, yeah.
So there's a website for old New York State newspaper archives.
There are so many.
There's a lot.
Yeah. Are
Give
you
like a
interested?
recommendation- Yeah, like give a recommendation of like,
Well, it depends. I mean, some are, if you go to newspapers.com, which I subscribe through Ancestry, you can go by region, you can go by state, you can name your town, and you can find a whole different list of papers that crop up on Northern New York, you know, there's two. huh?
Yeah, we actually have a subscription here at the Chapman, so if anybody wants to.
Yeah.
do a research archive, you're welcome to. Hey, do you have a place where you can, like, yeah, we have a research facility downstairs.
It's
Oh,
worth
really?
checking out those websites. There's one more called Fulton Postcards. Are you gonna say that?
The Crandall Library, if you go online to Crandall Public Library and you punch in you go into research and you go into archives and genealogy and you punch in your library card number. And it's all free. They've got Fold 3, which has all the military. records.
Right, that's great
And
for
it
that.
has New
Yep.
York State Historic newspapers. Were you the one asking?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yes.
and it's all, that's all free. And the Ancestry was free, but during COVID. but I
Not
guess they
anymore.
turned that off. But the newspapers, it's all free.
There's scans of the newspaper, like you can actually.
Yep, yep.
Newspaper.com is very helpful when you want to do kind of a national view of a problem. If I want to see where Adirondack leather was sold, I go to newspapers.com. I hit Virginia. I hit states with money that had commercial centers and people who would spend and who would buy fancy kid gloves that came down, or not kid gloves, other kinds of gloves, would come down to the Adirondacks from it. So that's a good one. And there's another site called Fulton Postcards. It's a very hard site, I think, to negotiate, but it is really strong in content.
But the first one you mentioned was Northern New York Library Network.
Well, you can
Right.
find it on that, but the site itself, or the name of it, is Northern New York Historical Newspapers.
Oh, it's so.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
And if you tap that in, it'll come in under NYSL or something like
And
that,
they let you search by county.
which is great.
By city.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can do a total county-based, even town-based search, which is wonderful. I was going to mention another product I forgot to mention because its impact is a little different from everything else, and that's quinine, which is so important for keeping malaria at bay. Until its discovery, you had no hope if you got malaria, but quinine changed the whole game. And it was slave harvested, it came from, I think, someone correct me if I'm wrong, does it come from a tree, the bark of a tree?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And is it produced in South America or it's not from this country, but it was slaves who harvested it. And what it does, it's the most interesting inversion. It makes Africa safe for white slave traders to enter. So it explodes the slave economy. The discovery of quinine and what it can do to keep the killer at bay, malaria, means slave traders flood into this new market where before it was too dangerous, too risky. It was the white man's graveyard, it was called. So that's another
Wow.
extraordinary result of this, the opening up, the acceleration of slavery because of the product of it.
Huh, wow.
Yeah, yes.
I'm curious what your personal take is on Black reparations. Like Harvard is just committed to the people that built Harvard, to their progeny, giving them money. What's your,
I think if the place can afford it, it's the right thing to do. But as a matter of general public policy and public institutions, for states to do it, for instance, or I think that's more complicated. I think Harvard's a private institution, and if that reflects the philosophy of the school and its idea of justice, let it do it. Let it spend some of that money. It's got enough. Yeah.
Do you have any observations to share with us concerning the activity of the Underground Railroad and local attitudes?
I don't know nearly as much about the UGRR as probably as Cliff knows in Warren County, but I don't think it was a hotbed of UGRR
No,
activity.
Washington County.
Washington County, proximity to Vermont is everything, because Vermont is an anti-slavery state in a big way, in a way New York never was. Vermont outlawed slavery from
Right
the
from the
very
beginning.
beginning of its organization and did it twice, and also outlawed the fugitive slave law, which no other state did, which made Alabama outlaw Vermont. Alabama wanted to get Vermont to secede, to get out of the Union because they were violating federal law. They had a point. They didn't, They didn't get anywhere with it, but that tells us long before the Civil War how sectionalized the country was over the slave interest. But in this town, in this county,
I think what was missing here too is geography.
well, yeah,
You think of New York and Vermont, they had Lake Champlain,
that's the
which goes
thing.
right into Canada.
All the counties that border Lake Champlain and the Hudson River have underground railroad networks that connect to each other, and they're not formal, they're not mapped. I mean, you'll see maps in books, but there's nothing like that. It was household to household, and the addresses change all the time. And
I knew Washington County was involved.
yeah,
In fact, we lived in a home that supposedly was on the railroad,
where was that? Wait.
in Hudson Falls,
Oh, really?
Sand Hill, the house.
Yeah,
The original part of the house was built in 1870.
yeah. But that raises another question, which is the romanticization of the Underground Railroad today and how important it is for local communities to claim some kind of redemptive role in the Civil War. And often these stories, which I think are very significant as folklore of what communities want to mean to themselves, will embrace a rumor of an Underground Railroad station where the evidence is wanting. And I don't think you can discount that, because the very interest of that community in wanting that as their truth, I think, is telling and lets us know how values shift and so
And
forth.
one of the ways to verify was what was the attitude
Right,
of the owner of the house. at
Yes.
the time.
yeah, and one of the
And would
things.
they have been open to
Yeah.
that or not?
And it's very easy to overestimate the zeal of anti-slavery people for abolitionism. These were different causes. The people who were drawn to abolitionism, radical abolitionism, immediate abolition, were very much the minority. And anti-slavery sentiment was easy enough to support if it didn't inconvenience you. It was a Southern problem. But abolitionism meant helping fugitives and doing something that could cost you thousands of dollars if you got bailed. I'm sorry?
Being pro.
Yeah, yeah. So any other questions? No? Yeah,
I just had a comment. If people are more interested in the rice and how rice was brought here, there's a book, it's called Black Rice. It's by Judith Carney, and it's well worth reading. It's
what's it
something that-
about?
So it's about the women who would put the rice grains into their hair.
Oh,
to bring
yeah.
them Here, yeah. So it's really just about where rice comes from and the cultural significance of that cultivation here that kind of gets lost.
I confess, when I first heard that, I hadn't done any homework and it sounded suspect to me.
Yeah.
I didn't buy it, and since then, there's so much documentation, I have no doubt that
What,
Yeah.
yeah, I just,
enslaved
what's
people.
that mean? I've heard just the reference to rice and hair. but-
Well, the important thing is that however they brought it, enslaved people were cultivating rice in Africa and brought that product and their art, their
Oh,
their knowledge of how to cultivate to this country and introduced through their own crops that they developed here, rice to the white planters who thought, this is good stuff. Let's do something with this. Yeah,
Was thinking about what you said about communities wanting to kind of jump on the Underground Railroad bandwagon, and you know, where's the evidence? But I remember, and I grew up around here, I remember seeing a house down in Fortsville, I think, south of South Glens Falls, where the owner showed us various hiding places, and we went actually down behind the fireplace and ended up, you know, being able to go outside of the home.
oh, what do you think? Were you persuaded?
Pardon?
Were you persuaded?
Oh, yes,
You
I
were.
was by that.
Yeah.
I mean, it seemed real. Now, the opposite is true also. When I was young, I remember going to a farm over by Argyle and being able to see in the barn actual shackles
Yeah.
on the walls. And that's just kind of the opposite. That's
Mhm.
evidence that
Mhm.
it happened.
That certainly happened in Essex County, where there was much more slavery. Not a lot, but more than there was here, and where slaves were chased and manacled if they fled and returned to slavery. Several stories of that in the Adirondacks.
So why
Yeah.
Essex County? I mean, well,
Yeah, what were they doing up there?
Well, Essex County borders the Hudson.
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So there's that. There are, it's closer to Vermont. There's more of an influx, a cultural imprint of Vermonters coming over to settle in Essex, maybe, than there is here. I'm not sure. I haven't done that kind of demography, but
But Essex County also had mining.
yes, it did.
Essex County had iron ore.
Yeah.
And
Philip Skeen's first
Skeen had-
miners were slaves, and he had at
Yes, right.
least 30 slaves who
Yeah,
worked for him.
and
They
they
were the
were
first
bringing-
miners in the Adirondacks.
Yeah, they were bringing iron from, the Fort Henry area
Mhm.
before Fort Henry became an iron center.
And he emancipates them, I think.
Skeen does?
I think so. Yeah. And he also loses them when he backs the wrong pony in the revolution and he has to leave. Yeah. Sir, you had a question back there, I think. Or you did.
The rights in the here, of the series High on the Hog and other things I read, they felt the rights in the here was somewhat suspect, but one thing they brought up was that slave traders also bought bags of beans and rice in Africa because they were very cheap. And they would keep well on a voyage, and it was a food that people were accustomed to eating.
Yeah,
Cheap, I mean, it didn't involve
Bought rice and beans.
protein animals,
yeah,
so that actually the slave traders brought a lot of rice and beans.
that makes sense
over on
too.
the
Yeah.
slave ships also.
Huh.
But they weren't necessarily growing it, they were importing it.
Well, they were feeding their
Well, they were
enslaved
growing it in
passengers
Africa,
with
right,
it.
right,
Yeah.
And then they're over with the slaves,
Yeah,
but they didn't necessarily have the idea that they could plant it and grow it
Right.
themselves.
and that apparently was an African introduction.
Yeah.
Huh. That's a good
But
one.
on Charleston, the plantation, many of the slaves were imported from specific areas in Africa, the winnowing baskets and all those things. It was all knowledge that was brought over by slaves from those specific areas where rice was grown in Africa.
It's very interesting to visit those plantations. Did you see any of them? When we were there, it was at least 10 or 12 years ago, and things have changed. There was a real divide between those slave plantation homes that were now public museums that offered the house tour of gracious Southern living. And then if you were interested, there's a separate tour that could tell you about the slaves and how it was for them, but that's later in the afternoon. They weren't integrated into one story. They were still segregated and not understood as referencing each other at every turn as really, and I think that's been called up in the last 5 years. There's much more attention to that, the nonsense of that and trying to correct that. And I'm sure there's a lot of pushback too. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I went on a tour in South Carolina of a rice plantation. And one thing they really emphasized was that because malaria was so prevalent, that the white owners would leave during malaria season, which meant that the overlords were Black. And the culture then stayed intact because they were allowed, since there were no white people to stop them, to practice their religion, speak their language, and do their different rituals, which when there were white overlords present, they did everything they could to prevent that.
I
So
see.
they're saying that that allowed the culture to remain viable.
Yeah. Well, that's another legacy that could be explored.
Hmm.
How traditions survived despite slavery and lasted. Well, I think that's it, unless there's one last one, but I don't.
Can I make, I'd like
Yeah,
to make
please.
a comment. All of these stories you hear, 80 to 80% family stories are true. And, I'm looking over this sea of history, because you all are little vessels of history. And I really want to encourage you to write it down. Write it down so it's not lost.
Yeah. Good advice. Well, thanks, you're a wonderful audience. Nice to see
Wonderful.
you.